A very good afternoon, morning, and evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Christopher Ludwig, and welcome to this special edition of the Livestream Hour, where we're going to be looking, as ever, at the global developments in the automotive supply chain, but this week looking in particular at what's happening in the European market in terms of demand, in terms of where we are with production restarts, in terms of the outlook over the coming year and beyond, and indeed, very importantly, the trends that are shaping, impacting, and indeed changing the automotive supply chain. And to do that, I've got some really great guests with me today who I'm very keen to bring onto stage with me soon and for you to hear from. So let's let's kick off without further ado, and I'll take you through our show today. So welcome again. Thanks again for joining us and for the live stream hour. Hopefully many of you who've been with us before, you're joining us on a weekly basis as we cover the key issues as part of our series here and also as part of our wider festival transformation. And we do that in partnership with some key players in the sector. I want to thank our key partners, key players in the automotive supply chain, C&W Korea Network, an important premium freight provider, Horizon Auto Logistics, an important port terminal and vehicle logistics provider, Fract Logistics Solutions, a supply chain and vehicle logistics IT provider, and Proact International, another important IT provider in the supply chain and finished vehicle logistics space. So thanks again to our partners, and do please check out information on them on our website and indeed their websites, because they're very specialized services for many of you in the audience relevant to what we discuss. Our guests today, we're very pleased that we'll be joined by Christoph Stürmer, Autofac's Global Lead Analyst at PwC. And Christoph will share some outlook on the European market and indeed some views on the global side, and looking into some of the trends which are impacting us at this stage in the crisis, not least also the impact and influence of government stimulus and indeed incentives. So, we'll have some really interesting detail and data to come with Christoph, and there'll be plenty of time for questions. And I'm also very excited that Livio Bidian, Supply Chain Director at LEONI, a very important wiring harness and electronics provider, will join us for Q&A and on the panel, and particularly be available to speak from a European supplier point of view, which is of course key to our theme today, and key very much to the recovery and to the trends which we're going to be outlining in many cases. Here's our running order. As mentioned, I'll kick us off with some global views and trends as we see them. We'll hand off to Christoph to talk through the European market and provide the insight, and we'll have some Q&A with Livio, and then we'll bring it to a close in the panel discussion. Before I kick off, let's start with the first audience poll. I'd like to get some of your views on what's happening in your European operations right now. So the poll is launching now. So hopefully you'll be able to see that any moment now. So for your company, at what level of capacity are you operating in Europe currently compared to normal? Are you running at up to 10% capacity, up to 25% capacity, up to 50% capacity, or up to 75% capacity, or greater than 75% capacity? So let us know. The polls are open now. Please share your views with us. I don't necessarily mean your overall production capacity. How are you in terms of what level you're running at? So get the audience another 30 seconds or so to vote, and I can see we have a bit of a mixed picture. And of course, we're gonna talk through some of the status of the market shortly, so that clearly Europe is very much still in a ramp up phase in general. So, but I think it's interesting to see that there's parts of the market which are recovering perhaps somewhat faster and starting to move in a brighter direction, and I can already see that in the vote pattern. So I'll go ahead and close the poll. Thanks very much for voting, and the results, as you should be able to see now. And apologies if you can't see it. I know there are sometimes some browsers where people struggle to see the views, but I'll just reveal that 41% of our audience are at least are up to 50% capacity. Another 27% are actually up to 75% capacity. So actually, a reasonable share, strong, and indeed almost 20% are greater than 75%. So actually, a pretty clear pattern there of being well above 50%. That probably reflects to some extent the level of the automotive industry right now, but nonetheless, we can see from our audience of suppliers, logistics providers, automation providers, OEMs, etc., what the situation is there. Okay, so let's talk briefly through some of our updates. We start off every week just looking at what's sort of happening in terms of plant openings and closures. We're different than we were a few weeks ago when there was still a ramp up. I think in Europe, we know most plants are open, but there was a few more that were still opening. I understand that Tichy FCA was due to start, I think, in the last day or so. So as far as I know, a few more plants and OEMs are moving on to 2 or even 3 shifts. This is not representative of everybody, but these are some of the ones that we understand. If we move globally, interesting situation in North America where almost all plants have restarted. There has been a lot of back and forth with Puebla, state of Puebla in Mexico, where even as early as Friday, they had ordered the Volkswagen and Audi not to reopen their plants there in the state. However, it does appear that Volkswagen restarted or at least reopened to some extent yesterday. And there's nonetheless obviously some issues there, but that does sort of open up all the plants, certainly not at full capacity, but nonetheless opens all the plants in North America. And we see, as I'm sure we'll get some snapshots from Christoph later, North America is moving to capacity, and there's even some OEMs who expect to be at full capacity as early as July, but there will be plenty of questions about how sustained that recovery is or can be. Elsewhere in the world, we look in Brazil, where the crisis is arguably at its worst. We have seen most OEMs reopen plants, but it's at quite low capacity. India is similar. There's still more open, but at a low rate. We saw Honda open some plants. So I thought it was interesting to see some movement on some Chinese OEMs there. MG adding a new production of a new model in Halal, and Great Wall signing an MOU to invest $1 billion in a former GM plant in Taligian. So things happening, although clearly at reduced capacity. As I mentioned, so this is what's closed or reclosing. Mexico's still question mark. Puebla, the state still restricting some output there, and overall we understand Mexican supplier capacity to be quite restrained, which of course could hold back some of the US and Canadian production as well. In Europe, there are plants who will remain closed, be it for low demand or perhaps for some model adjustments and things. So we know some plants are already set to be closed as late as September. So obviously we're not fully all opened and ramped up. As a situation there. And just as a highlight, it's not really indicative of but Kia had to shut a couple of plants on some COVID cases this week in Korea, continue to lower output because of low export. It just underlines, I think, the ongoing risks that any region faces really, in terms of outbreaks, second waves, or even, kind of small isolated cases. We could see this disrupt production, perhaps only in the short term or for short periods, but nonetheless, that's very much a part of the new normal, so to speak. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but these are the trends that we keep tracking and sharing with you. This is still the overall kind of fragility, if you like, of the automotive supply chain, which has proved remarkably resilient in many ways in this kind of recovery phase. But nonetheless, as we see, there's still many risks, not least of which is the volatility of demand and how that will play out in the coming weeks and months between potential bullwhip effects and pull forwards, and how that could distort the shape of the recovery. Liquidity is still a major risk in the supply chain. Logistic networks are by no means back to normal, although they continue to recover. There's still lots of disruption on different trade lanes and certain areas around in shipping and in air freight. And as I kind of highlighted there, there's plenty of disruption that could still tilt and knock down supply for a period, whether it was a cyber attack we saw last week, or indeed social unrest or other partial lockdowns that we might see. And looming in the background and perhaps in the foreground in some places is ongoing trade disputes, regulatory issues, whether it's the rising fear again of a hard Brexit, pending USMCA implementation, threats of a so-called lobster tax. You've heard of the chicken tax. Get ready for the lobster tax, from the US, and of course the US-China tensions, which are not going away. So these are all just some of the fun that the industry continues to face. Kind of moving on to Europe, I'm not going to dwell too much here because Christoph will provide more, but just a flash, this is the latest forecast that we've done with our partners ECG Business Intelligence, where you see some expectations for declines of around 20–25%, but highly kind of dependent and varied on potential incentives. We see some improvements in the European market, if you can call them that, from 80% down in April to 58% down in May, and plants slowly ramping up. So it's a complicated situation, to say a difficult situation to say the least, and there are plenty of difficult issues, structural shifts that we'll continue to face. I mentioned some of them before. There's a question about incentives and what the role they'll play. I'm going to wait for Christoph to give you more on that. Lots of job losses being announced, prospect of more plant closures to come, and even potential competition from new upstarts in areas when we look at the Chinese EV imports and plans that some of those brands have. So, and not to mention plans from some OEMs to import from Europe. So I think BMW's X3, electric X3 will be imported from China. So quite an interesting, complex picture there. When we look at in the supply chain, what do we expect to see? Plenty of short-term and medium long-term impacts. If we look at supply chain product planning, we already see OEMs reducing model and dealers reducing model configurations, certainly prioritizing the profitable or potentially incentivized products and inventory which are there. But of course, long term, we see significant reductions in platforms as OEMs do more to share parts, reduce R&D, and reduce supply complexity, kind of going on economies of scale. That's not a new trend, but that's something we see significantly escalating in the wake of the crisis. Clearly, there's also the adjustments that companies have to make in the new normal, so to say, to stay safe in terms of adhering to social distancing, kind of PPE requirements. These over time, could significantly increase costs and lead to higher automation in some areas. Sourcing shifts and changes, again, perhaps we see some shifts to higher inventory right now because of all the disruption. Do we see in the future shifts in global sourcing patterns, more resilient local supply chains, regional supply chains, dual sourcing? These are all things we're talking about and hearing from our OEM contacts as potential outcomes of the next phase of the crisis. And indeed, there's the online service, which has started to emerge as a necessity with dealerships closed in so many countries. But OEMs move to adapt, provide online tours, remote testing, contactless delivery. Seems that the move could be sooner than later towards a more integrated online buying and service process. So certainly an interesting set of developments, which we think have quite a lot of advantages and opportunities in the supply chain, and that sort of answers some of the questions here. Do we see opportunities in the European supply chain? Well, we certainly do, from EV and battery investment to opportunities in green infrastructure investment and how that might impact logistics services, the focus on economies of scale, new technologies, or at least the faster adaptation of technologies, maybe I should say. And overall, and this is something I'll look to talk with Liviu later as well, perhaps as well, the focus on supply chain management and logistics management as a discipline, we think certainly has increased in appreciation as a result of this crisis in Europe and indeed elsewhere. So that's a bit of an overview just from my side, just to get us sort of going. I'd like to now introduce and bring on our first panelist and guest, Christoph Stürmer, Autofac's Global Lead Analyst from PwC. Christoph, very good to have you with us. Thank you for joining.
Pleasure to be here. And
I will pass this on to you now. So thanks, Christoph.
Thank you very much. Please shout if technology doesn't work, but if it does, let's keep going. We have 15 minutes to explain the world and its future. So let's get going. As PwC, we have been analyzing, of course, the effects of the Corona crisis as well as the connected measures in very great detail. So what I would like to share with you is an internal working document of PwC. It is not a publication, it's not thought leadership piece. So please consider this an inside view into what we do and how we think. Please don't share it with everybody, but sort of keep it in your cupboard. That's where it belongs. So, and this is why we call this a scenario analysis, and it's not a forecast, although I've been a forecaster for about 25 years now. So let's dive in, Christoph. And what is it that this crisis has been impacting? And I think the important thing is that the automotive industry, and this is very important for other people to understand, doesn't only consist of car plants, but it consists, of course, a very important part of the industry is the market. It's the demand side, the sales side, the retail side, the distribution side of finished vehicles. Of course, it's the OEM plants, but there's very little that the OEMs actually do. There's all the suppliers that do a lot, and the service companies as well. And then finally, it's all about the money, and the flows of money play another very big role in the game. So in order to get a better understanding of how the crisis is evolving, we sort of cut it up into three pieces. First piece, basically the cut down and closing phase, which was a bit of a rush job, wasn't very well performed on all sides. But those companies that had 100% automotive exposure really had to close down almost entirely, with a couple of OEMs, of course, not closing their books and not closing their order system, which caused a couple of, let's say, a little bit of confusion from time to time. But I think that has been sorted out, and now everybody is looking into what we would call the medium-term phase, the restart and recovery phase. And we're still in that, and we're going to remain in that for quite a while, and I'll explain why. And finally, of course, it's about what's happening next. What's happening next? What is the so-called new normal? You possibly heard that buzzword already. And believe me, we've been thinking about that quite a while, but it's not easy to find out. And it's not easy to make up your mind about this. So where are we now? We're in the midterm. And so on the market side, we will be looking at, of course, the trade-off between the immediate freeze up of demand, both the immediate one as well as, let's say, the more current one due to economic difficulties. On the other side, what is it that we are seeing in terms of incentives, and what is their possible effect? And we've already seen a couple of incentive programs being formulated, and we're waiting for others to follow suit. Secondly, of course, we're looking at ways that the OEMs are restarting production. Some of them because they have to, like Salzgitter, I think they were forced by the Chinese to start assembling and delivering transmissions in order to put them into vehicles made in China. So this is all entirely interesting, and the fun bit about it is that we don't have one ramp up, and we don't only have it on the OEM level, but we have all OEMs and all suppliers and all intermediary services trying to get back from a very, very low level to a substantial level at almost synchronously. So we have a multiplication of ramp ups, and one ramp up alone can be a little bit of a nuisance. And we have this all synchronously, with the additional difficulty that no one knows what the target level of output really should be. So it is infinitely difficult. So if your clients can't really tell you what they want, it is because they don't know what they're looking at. And so I think this is a time for really being open and for communicating on an absolute transparent and absolute real-time basis. Of course, this brings us to the supplier base. Everybody is really deeply connected with everybody else, and then there's logistics in between. So this whole clockwork, this is really a very, very complicated clockwork. It's all grind to a halt. And we're now trying to unfreeze it, get it back. I was on the Autobahn just the other day, and I was very happy to see trucks on the road again, like lots of them. And lots of them were loaded with big machinery that couldn't be delivered over the last couple of months. So it's been built, it's been sitting there, and it couldn't be delivered, which means that the bills couldn't be sent, which brings us to the final bit. We call it the shockwave effect. So if an OEM doesn't build cars, they won't pay their suppliers the next month, who will not pay their suppliers the month after, who will not pay their suppliers the month after. So the cash crunch has really only just begun. And we've heard of OEMs who have one-sidedly extended their payment period to 3 months just because they need the money for themselves. And this is, of course, something that is still in the works. It's hard to count in terms of cash flows because it all goes very discreetly. But this is something that is going to have a very important effect on your boss's bosses, on the banks. And we're very worried about this. And it also brings a very important element to the incentive programs. Maybe we can go to the next slide now. How do we think? Well, where are we now? And I think I don't have to read out the numbers now. Everybody has seen the ASEA real registrations this morning, shockingly low, almost 60% lower than the same month year before, but still a lot better than the month before, which was minus 85%. So 25% better, but still devastating low. This just gives us an idea of the depth of the crisis that we're in. The only country that's sort of almost come through the dip now, the countries are in South Asia, are in Eastern Asia, so it's China, it's Korea, but as we just heard, it's a little bit of a fragile environment there. The trick is, what you can also see here in this chart is that new registrations or sales are decoupling from production. And we've seen this before. We've seen this before in 2009 when sales were pushed up artificially through the incentive programs, but production just remained, but just flatlined. And at this time, the incentives were just used to sell off stock vehicles. There was a huge amount of overstocking before the crisis in 2008, 2009. So the incentives were burnt on stock cars, and the suppliers basically only had a positive effect after the incentives were spent. This is something that really was in people's mind, and we can see a little bit of that. So China sold about 500,000 out of stock last month. The US sold about the entire month out of stock in April, like a full half month. They were only minus 50%. Now they're minus 30%. Production sort of last month wasn't good. So another 1 million out of stock. Stock is getting short in the US, and I think we're also getting into a more balanced position in Europe. So this is basically the take-home message. Good sales doesn't mean good production, and it does not at all mean good deliveries for suppliers. Let's continue, let's go deeper. So how are we looking at this? We've been looking at this in terms of 4 scenarios. We were naive, of course, in the beginning to assume that it would be a quick dip. 4 weeks closure, nothing changed, nothing happened, all the structures are intact. So we're still sort of looking at this, which is basically our optimistic base case, a pure theoretical case. What would happen if everything sprung back to normal miraculously after the closures are over? We'll look at that. Second one is the even shorter V scenario. So we have a dip, and then we come back out, and then we overshoot because of very good, well-made incentives on the demand side, which of course, because they're well-made, they would have a corresponding effect on the supply side. Well, let's have a look at that. Currently, the deep impact scenario, like a very wide and deep crisis, was our current let's say we started it off as the worst case scenario, and it's now turned out to be the real case scenario. So worst case is real case is following the worst case scenario. And then of course we have the joker, we have the worst of the worst. That is, if two things happen. Firstly, if the virus comes back visibly, and if the governments can't think of anything better than closing down the economy for good. If the virus doesn't come, this is not going to happen, or if the governments can think of something better than just plainly closing down and locking everybody up, then this L scenario, the double zip scenario, will not happen. And I'm very happy about every day that we can live without the second dip, because every day gives us and the governments a chance to understand how to do it better next time. Let's go deep into the numbers. And these are all simulations, and these are all outputs of scenario analysis. What's the good thing about a scenario analysis? The main message of a scenario analysis is the description of a logical path. How would stuff evolve if it evolved logically? So what a scenario tells you basically is how things are not going to happen, because it's illogical that it's going to happen in a certain way. So what are the four logical paths, the results of the four logical paths that we described? Let's start in the middle, third row, basically the deep impact scenario, which is basically our base case scenario, currently takes us to global sales of 55 million passenger vehicles, which is minus 26% global. Now you would say, how can it be so deep when China is already on the way back? The main culprit in this is actually the US. We looked at the example of the 2009 crisis, and we found that the US market was devastated for 4 quarters in a row after the 2009 crisis. So there's a huge leverage of the economy and unemployment on new vehicle sales in the US. So that's basically this low, the low ceiling basically in the global forecast is the assumed economic effect of the crisis on the US and North American market. This in turn drags down production in Japan and Korea, because they export a lot of vehicles to the US. And it sort of has an impact on European production, but we'll look into that a little bit more. So that's worst case, i.e. base case. If we get the incentives right on a global scale, so if China can pull off an incentive miracle of plus 20% in the second half year, if the US come back with a very powerful cash for clunker scheme, and if the combined effects of the European incentives as we see them now actually take hold, we can make up about 8% of the global market just out of incentives. That is really impressive for government intervention, but it is still not enough to fill up the gap of 25% or more. Third case, sort of the theoretical case, if everything jumped back to normal from where we are now, we would still have lost 17%, 15.7% of global vehicle sales. And then ultimately the double dip, if things go back and then fall back into a trough, it would be minus 24%. So as you can see, deep impact and double dip are almost the same as a result, but the path is different. So double dip assumes a very quick opening and then punishment through a return of the virus. And the other scenario assumes a very cautious opening and no return of the virus. So two scenarios. Let's go deeper into Europe. So European sales. So as we saw, April was minus 85%, May minus 60%. And we are assuming that it will take the markets actually about 3 months to come back in incremental steps, and only then you really see the scenarios sort of branch out. European deep impact scenario, that is, we have sales as they were, and then on top we have a deep economic crisis that is both going to keep private buyers from buying as well as keep companies from investing. We're looking at minus 35% sales. in Europe, and that comprises a certain element of stock sales already. If the incentive programs that we're currently seeing that have already been formulated are going to materialize in Europe, we assume an increase effect, sort of a makeup of about 4% of the market. And in our previous scenario analysis, it was about 6%, but the incentives that we're now seeing are not so effective for the total market. Impact scenarios, if everything jumped back to normal, like best of worlds, we would still lose minus 30% for European sales, according to our simulation. And then if the virus would come back in the fourth quarter, and if the governments didn't have any better ideas than to lock us all back up, we would end up at minus 38%, which is as a level, well, we haven't compared it really, but it would be around 2007 levels, about around 2009 levels again. So let's go back and let's take Germany as an example of the incentive schemes that have now been formulated. Our basic assumption is, so the German incentive scheme for automotive contains three parts. One part is direct incentivation, direct cash out incentivation for electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids. Second element is reduction of value-added tax by 3% for everything, for everybody. And I can tell you, our tax people at PwC, they love it. They'll have work to do for the next 10 years to just get this temporary reduction of value-added tax into all the companies and then out of all the companies. It's going to be a nightmare, and we're very grateful. It's the great subsidy, and I'm sorry for being cynical. It's a great subsidy for all accounting firms. Finally, the third element, and we like that a lot, is massive subsidies into the buildup of both charging infrastructure, public charging infrastructure, and commercial charging infrastructure, as well as, especially in Germany, telecommunications and bandwidth for internet bandwidth. So these three elements combine, and in this combination, we expect the overall market effect to be in the area of 4%. Why so low? And this is where we get it. Why so low? Because all the electric vehicles can either not be built or they have already been sold. I don't know if anybody of you has tried to actually order an electric car. Waiting times are 6 months or more. So all the electric vehicles that are built now have been ordered back last year and just haven't been built or haven't been delivered. So throwing more money at electric vehicles for a limited period of time, we think is not going to be too effective in terms of additional market push, because there's supply restraint. There's not enough that you can build, at least in this very year. Of course, every week we get a new announcement about a new electric car that is now deliverable. And of course, Christopher, as you said, BMW is even thinking about importing electric iX3 from China because they can't build them in Europe. But that's not this year. That's not this week. It's not next week. It's not next month. That's going to take a while. So we're a bit skeptical on the effect of the incentive programs as they were built, as they are now being rolled out for new vehicle sales, and therefore also for new vehicle production. There's some good in the bad, and maybe we can look at the next slide. There are no used electric vehicles in the market. So every electric vehicle actually that you had planned to supply into or to build this year, we think is actually going to be built. So the crunch of the market is going to happen outside of the subsegments of electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. So get everything ready for building all the electric vehicles that are available, but be ready for a big crunch on non-electric vehicles. Production side, So we're looking at minus 37%. And this is where you see the difference. The difference between the crunch in sales and the crunch in production is actually sales out of stock. So vehicles that are already being built and that are sitting on parking lots at the moment. Production with incentives, minus 33% according to our simulation. And they're now in a quite narrow band, actually. They were a lot wider in previous simulations. So this is the overall picture for European production. As you saw, we were assuming April basically dead, May production coming up slowly. And you heard me, and we think that production is going to lag sales by quite an amount due to technical difficulties, but also due to the fact that we still have a lot of cars sitting out there that the OEMs and retailers will want to sell first. And then we have very active used car markets. Those of you who are in the used car market, I think the used car markets were not hit as hard as the new car markets. And we're going to see a lot of consolidation going on between individual markets. So shipping used cars around could also be good business. I think this is the end. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions now. Recovery, multi-year recovery. We just saw a chart from Christopher with a rather steep recovery for 2021. So yes, we think that production in Europe in the deep impact scenario may jump as much as 35% next year, but from a much lower basis. So we think that for next year, 12-13 million is already a high shot. We think it's going to take a while to get back. And this is exactly the question of what's the target level for monthly output? What's the target level for weekly output for the rest of the year? And we think the target level for weekly output for the rest of the year is going to be 2 shifts instead of 3. And for next year, it's going to be 2 full shifts instead of 3. And I think we can only go back to full capacity basically in 2020, of course, with some exceptions. But this is just the structural analysis. We'll have to look at the economic fallout in more detail once we understand it. Now, sorry.
That's quite all right. Thank you so much, Christoph. Fantastic insight there, and thank you for sharing, as you said, a kind of, what do you say, a bit of a secret analysis or an early analysis. But I think it gave us a lot of. It definitely has prompted a lot of questions, and I sort of like your line coming from PwC that it's a great subsidy in Germany for accounting firms, but what it will mean for stimulating the industry is perhaps another question. What I'd like to do is, if you don't mind, to take questions after we speak a bit to Liviu, so that one, I can hold that as an incentive for some of our audience to stick around and get some of your answers to their questions, because we've had a number in already. But I would like to get a bit of the view now from a supplier, so that we can kind of go from the analysis to talk about the supply chain, and then we'll come back to you in about 15 minutes or so. So I want to thank Christoph for those slides and that insight, and he'll be back a bit later. So, hi Liviu. So great, thank you for joining us.
Hi Chris, good afternoon to you and to everyone in the show here.
Absolutely. So Liviu is supply chain director. He's responsible for inventory management, internal audit, and control for global supply chain management at LEONI Wiring Systems. And again, obviously great to get you here to give some perspective on the supplier side. I thought, could we just start with a little bit of a status update in terms of, obviously we saw from our audience about where they were, about 50% or so at capacity, would probably make up the majority. We saw Christoph's slides referring to with a slow kind of ramp up. What you see in LEONI and also in the supplier industry, how would you characterize that currently in terms of its current?
Let's say on the aggregate level, of course, we can discuss about different percentages, and we can look at it, let's say, holistically, just to get an idea of where we are. Nevertheless, LEONI and in general automotive, it's a quite integrated industry. So everyone depends of anybody else, and at the moment, so we are running at different speeds on different projects. So we have restarted the activity in all of our facilities, and I guess this is the case for the majority across the supply base in automotive world. Nevertheless, different projects, they go to different speeds, and then what we do, then we adjust ourselves exactly to that. So if the customer would push its manufacturing, then we will push it as well. If the customer will break it or slow it down, then we will do that too. And of course, then besides the customer alone, then specifically for us, then we also needed to adapt a lot our internal processes, and because of the safety and compliance topics. So then we do have then our, let's say, safety measures and all the impact that we need to integrate in our planning. So that's quite challenging.
Absolutely, and I mean it's a challenge for any supplier, and I think especially suppliers in the wiring harness and other areas which are certainly higher manual labor than some others. I can imagine that organizing the protocols, the screens, the social distancing, can be particularly challenging for companies like that.
Yeah, absolutely. But then let's say for us, I mean, safety is number one and it's not negotiable. So then we have had really a huge effort with all the teams across the globe to make it happen. And fortunately, we were successful in doing that and aligning this with our customer plans and priorities. So everything runs according to the plan so far.
I talked about this early on. I was mentioning that obviously we've seen a lot of disruption in the European supply chain in terms of logistics as well. From your view, from what you see in the tier supply chain, is that still a significant issue, or are sort of logistics and network disruptions, causing delays and issues, or are we kind of moving on to a different phase?
So obviously, I mean, the structural issues of European logistics, they haven't gone away now during the crisis, right? So we were discussing always about, the availability of the drivers, the capacity of the infrastructure, the congestion, and so on. So everything has been at a certain point more exacerbated by the crisis, because then at a certain point, if you don't have enough drivers to run normally, then if you put them in quarantine, then obviously you have less available and you struggle a little bit. Nevertheless, what we can see now is that everyone is adjusting. So if it's the right word to say, I would say adjustment is the word. And I guess that's what happens in our industry, but also with the partners that we work with.
Absolutely. I mean, we just saw also from Christoph, obviously the uncertainty in demand and in the difficulty and challenge in forecasting right now. When we talk about supply chain planning right now, in terms of communication that you have with that the suppliers have with OEMs, have with other suppliers, how would you sort of characterize it right now? Is it as close as it should be? Is there frequent adjustments and sharing? Is it in real time, or in fact, are we still seeing some lags, if you like, between forecasts and reality and call-offs as we did at perhaps earlier stages of the crisis?
Well, what should I say? So communication obviously is key, and being part of the supply chain, you need to absolutely you need to keep the communication channel open, both with your customers and your suppliers. And obviously everyone is doing its best to communicate as better as possible, to communicate as complete as possible with all the information that's possible. Nevertheless, I guess that there are two additional factors that come on top of what used to be the supply chain communication challenge, and that is is first, the evolution of the virus itself, on which, for instance, there are certain cases in a region, and then out of the blue, from today to tomorrow, the region is closed, and then nobody could plan or forecast that or could announce anything about that. Or then there are the interventions of the government related to regulations of how the people can travel, how the people can work, what are the times, and so on. And all that obviously played an additional challenge on already a very, let's say, complex communication that we have in between each of the partners. Specifically, I guess that in automotive, then we do communicate well. Obviously, we can communicate much better at many times. Nevertheless, during this time, I guess that the bullwhip effect could be observed much stronger than at other times.
No, absolutely. In terms of kind of supplier agreements or with providers, I mean, we saw some instances of force majeure kind of early in the crisis and things. And I wonder, do you see shifts towards changing agreements and contracts and terms? Is that likely to sort of follow in the next stages of the recovery as well?
Well, at the moment, I guess that everyone is focused on what's happening to have business continuity, to support the customers, to go in the right direction. And obviously, in some cases, then this works, let's say, pretty well, as is can be integrated in the entire planning. At cases then when there are significant deviations to the planning, then this costs a lot. And obviously, whatever you do in supply chain in addition to what was planned, then it has a cost, and then that cost obviously it's arbitrated, is managed by the contract. Now, if you have a good contract, then it's quite clear to say, well, what would happen and who should be liable for. And then in some other cases, if your contract is not sufficiently good, or it's not updated, or it's not, it's not containing all the necessary clauses at this date, then it would be much more difficult. So most likely not in the current time. Nobody will focus at the moment on negotiating or, let's say, updating contracts. But obviously, I guess one of the lessons learned in the future would be one to have a closer look and to clarify much better, that little sentence about liability, who does what when things cannot go the right way, and who pays, especially when the things they go in the wrong direction.
That's certainly, I'm sure, a key question, and one that will still be working itself out given the abruptness of the shutdowns and all the inventory that was sort of moved around or stuck at that point. Kind of talking about inventory for a moment, because obviously inventory management is something that you look at carefully in your role. Do you see, I mean, obviously there was the shutdown and that required a period of holding, but do you see the likelihood of change in inventory patterns in the supply base in terms of perhaps holding more stock than was usual, perhaps some shifts from the lean and just in time, or is there other factors at play here?
Well, as said, at the moment, I guess that's the current focus is just to keep things going, and obviously then there are several factors that goes into that. So the first thing, alignment, I guess, is the key word. So at the moment, then what you try to do is to synchronize your manufacturing with the customer manufacturing, and obviously then in the beginning of the crisis, when everyone was so optimistic about this, to say, well, we will shut down maybe for 2 weeks, maybe up to 4 weeks, but then everything will come back to normal. So some of the people then, they started to build, the inventory to just catch up with the backlog, just to fill some holes, to avoid some costs which were taking place due to missing of inventory before. So all that was a good thing. Now, let's say what we can observe is that on one side, there is sufficient supply pending, to be processed, and there is sufficient inventory on the pipeline. nevertheless, what we can observe is that at certain points, then because of all the macroeconomics and all the explanations which were said earlier, then we would see sudden mix changes. So no longer the customer plans to produce that specific model because it doesn't comply now with the new incentives and so on, but then they want to produce the other project, the other model, or they want to produce, different type of equipment inside the car. So then this plays a challenge to respond to the or short term to the mix. And whether you have the right inventory, then this is the right question, and this will always stay. I mean, if you have too much or too less, it's always bad. But then to have the right one, that's the key. And how to get the right one, of course, then you need to use your tools and practices and everything else so that you make it happen.
Absolutely. I mean, you also talk obviously about clearly having to follow what the OEMs are doing on a volume basis, and I'm sure that also goes to some extent on geographies as well with other platforms. One of the things we spoke about earlier, it came up from Christoph and from me, was the potential of regionally resilient supply chains. Maybe more shift towards regional or local supply chains in some cases. Now, I know that's a complicated decision and doesn't weigh on any one single factor. But from your point of view as a supplier, can you see that as a longer term or medium term outcome here, or less so?
Well, at the moment, I guess that it's on the table related to the scenario planning, and obviously the business cases will decide whether we'll go on one direction or another. I guess what is playing a key role versus, let's say, the standard situation with the scenarios is in many cases what the OEMs are doing and what is their commitment in terms of their strategies and implementation of what they do. I mean, just a quick recap. I mean, France has put on the table 8.8 billion through Automotive Recovery Plan, but then this comes with some deeds, with some very clear requirements to say, well, if you get the money, then you need to produce in France. And, I mean, in the past, governments, they were incentivizing that, and they were looking, in terms of country of origins and all that added to the package so that you produce in as local as possible and so on. But then nowadays, then it's made much more clear to say, okay, we give you the money, but you keep everything local. And for instance, Valeo said, well, okay, we'll take the money, but then we will start to produce high voltage more in France, or situations like that. So that would be very much depending if there would be a structural shift in terms of supply chain, would be very much depending on how the state aid will come and this additional factor of the government voice inside.
Absolutely, and some of that I'm going to ask when Christoph comes back on as well for his views. But maybe another question for you, whilst we have you, would be looking at that from a risk management point of view. So clearly, risk management is something that everyone in the supply chain knows plenty about and works through with the scenario planning, perhaps come more to the fore now than ever before. Do you see a likelihood that risk management processes will change, have bigger impacts on the sourcing, production, commercial decisions that industry companies make?
Well, in my own perspective, I would say that the risk management is making its way through the core of the function, and obviously during those times we could observe that as many tools you have ready available that you can use, then you'll have the likelihood to make better decisions, make informed decisions, and really to save your money, to save energy on getting the data, on sourcing the data, and to really understand whether you have a problem on the short term or you'll have a problem on the mid-term. Because remember, everything started with shutting down China, and then everyone was crazy. Where are your suppliers? Do you have a problem? Yes or no, and so on. And then it started to move around the world. And then if you have the right tools in terms of risk management and you know where your suppliers are, what is your time to recover, then you'll be obviously well equipped to know exactly what to do and to have responses. But then if you don't, then obviously then you'll spend a lot of time, a lot of calls and a lot of Excel files, and in the end you'll not be sure whether you have the right answer or not, right? So then in midterm, I guess, yeah, it would be part of the lesson learned.
Maybe the last question before I bring Christoph also back in. As you just raised there, if you knew where your suppliers were, then you could better understand, or where they were in the situation, especially in the tier N supply chain, which is becoming, which every single crisis brings up, right? Whether it's Japan earthquake or this, and it seems like the industry always scrambles and realizes, oh, I didn't realize that we had so many tier 2 or tier suppliers in this location. In your view, is the tier N visibility, had it significantly improved in time for this crisis, or actually should it be much more robust than it is right now in terms of visibility of tier N and lower suppliers?
Well, I guess that's quite arguable, related to the type of the products you are doing. So and also how transparent is your tier N supply chain, and how you're able to react to it. I would say that because of this bullwhip effect, so what has happened is that the entire pipeline has been refilled, and then it has stopped. So disruption we will see now, let's say, a little bit more coming ahead, when there would be a problem of synchronizing, the refilling of the pipeline and everything. And I would not be in the position to say that in the last 2 months or 3 months, then many things have changed. Obviously, there would be a homework related to tier N, but as well, something to come.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing some of those views. I'd like you to stay, if you don't mind, just stay, because I'd like to bring Christoph Stürmer back into our discussion here, because we also have audience questions that kind of can go across the both of you. So Christoph, welcome back. Thanks for rejoining us. So Christoph, I think one of the questions that has been coming in, and something that I also was on my mind after seeing obviously the scale of some of the declines that we see in this year, and then obviously the potentially long recovery, is should we be expecting a significant capacity footprint adjustment in Europe? We know Barcelona from Nissan already. Is there likely to be more plant closures? And where might we expect that to happen?
I am not sure, because I know that we have a short-term impact in terms of production, but I also know that we have too many old cars out there, and we know that, of course, electric vehicles now get subsidies, and the infrastructure is being built up, and in order for people to get electric cars, we have to build them first, because there are no used ones. If we assume that there's going to be a fleet renewal over the next decade, we have 250 million cars to get off the streets within the next 10 years, which basically means 25 million per month, 25 million per year, and not 15 as the market has been trending. So our opinion is that if fleet renewal really kicks in, we need more factories than we can muster. And I think a good example of this is the amount of battery capacity that is being installed. I just saw a chart the other day that battery system capacity in Europe is now targeting 500 gigawatt hours per year, which is okay because we had a forecast of 400 gigawatt hours for 2025. So we're nearing scale of something that could actually furnish a park renewal. I think we're going to need vehicle factories, and we're going to need well-operated vehicle factories.
So that's interesting. I mean, clearly, as you mentioned, the need to build. I mean, obviously, that there might be some mismatches for what the capacity that's available now versus perhaps what some of the needs will be for those vehicles. So I suppose there'll be questions about how that capacity, how fast that can be adapted and adjusted. You know, on the, I think, Livio, from your point of view, you know, are you anticipating in the supply base some shifts and changes in the shape of the supplier base in terms of locations? I think you're based in Romania, so obviously there's obviously been growth there. But you know, in terms of from your perspective, where do you see that developing?
Well, I guess just to pile on a little bit on what Christoph was saying, I guess that when we look to Europe today in terms of capacity for the automotive, I mean, it was a well-known fact that Europe was already overcapacitized, right? So then being so, then at this moment, then with this, let's say, clear decision to move towards to change the powertrain, and then there is no way to keep going in this direction. So that's why we can see and we can observe this huge, announcements related to job cuts that goes in both OEM's side, but also in the supply base side, right? And Autoliv, I guess, was one of the most vocal one with huge numbers announced. So now that's one side of the story. Then the other side of the story, I guess, goes to the product development, as what we could see in terms of cars which were produced. Then there were cars produced with, on the existing platforms. So there was not necessarily new platforms which they were defined. And then as a result of that, there was, an internal combustion car which just got a battery and then everything else where it has the space. So now this will change, right? And the new cars will come on their own being electrical cars. And obviously then this would give a disruption in the supply base related to whom would have the true R&D and the true responses to what would be the future challenges on getting these new cars and getting these new concepts, right? Because then we discuss about completely different concepts versus what we knew classical automotive.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. Christoph, we've had a few questions related to incentives, and hard to summarize as a few, but I think one interesting one that maybe is a good starting point. The question on German incentives was whether the restriction in the value, which I believe, not to go into too much detail here, but I think it's most valuable up to 40,000 effectively, and then it starts to scale down. So most valuable on a low emission up to 40,000. The question is, doesn't that in fact incentivize non-German OEMs more than potentially other OEMs like French OEMs or even potentially Chinese OEMs if they can get there in time? So I suppose that's maybe to address that, but then that's part of a larger question, really, I guess, about the roles that national incentives can and should play in the context of the European Union and the single market, and kind of navigating through that complexity, really, isn't it? Because obviously governments would be pushed on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, lots of questions there. First of all, I mean, there's a reason why the VW ID.3 has an entry price of 39,000 euros. It's quite clear, I think. And I mean, this is the kind of guidance that the auto industry sometimes needs in order to sort of stay on course towards a certain direction. Of course, any regulation that you have to implement is the effect of a structural rigidity that sort of needs to be overcome. I think from what I saw in terms of incentives, so when we look at the German program and the Spanish program, they're very much alike. Of course, as usual, the French took exception, but they have had the bonus malus system for a number of years now. So in their mix, they're overemphasizing, of course, the support of the industry bit, which is also a part of this mix of three elements of the German and the Spanish incentive. So it's just a little bit different, but it's still the same old ingredients in order to bake this cake. Because they look so strikingly similar, I do assume that the European Commission or Union has had a hand in there in order to sort of make sure that the incentive programs are sort of compatible, because you don't want anybody to really do something completely different to what everybody else does, just in order to avoid fines, etc. So incentives. Currently, we've just run a major market research with asking lots of people, and we can really see 68% of all people we asked actually have a positive connotation to electric vehicles. They would love to have one, only they either can't get one, or they're so bad that they don't want them, or they're too expensive so that they can't afford them. So there's this huge dynamic in the industry, and I think that if there's any positive to this crisis, it may be that the crisis will have an overproportionate effect on the rigidities, on the old structures in the industry, and they may just break away and open the space for new structures. Livio, as you just said, if there's not enough classic wire harnesses to sell, hey, then we can actually free the capacity to build more bus wires and to do something else very effectively, and to reshift investments rather than conserve the old stuff. But that's, to be quite honest, we're still in a crisis. I'm not saying that we don't have a crisis, but if we look at the third stage of the transformation, it may be that the industry just sort of needed this nudge to sort of shift and switch into transformation mode.
It's a powerful point, and I mean, Livio, as you were alluding to, I mean, do you see from a supplier point of view a readiness and willingness to jump at those opportunities? I mean, clearly there's risks that come given the uncertainties now, but as Christoph alluded to, I mean, there are potentially accelerations in some of this transformation as we've been seeing before.
So obviously, ourselves as a company, we are very focused on that, on the electric vehicle market, and at the moment we have quite a good portfolio of already order intake. So our percentage is quite good in terms of total sales, and so it goes to pretty much to pretty good levels compared to it's going compared to what it used to be. So that's the first thing. Now a second thing to consider is that majority of the investments today, it is taking place in this area, and this is not related to our company alone, but then this goes, let's say, in the entire supply base. And we know that you know, the automotive industry, I mean, with the COVID or without the COVID crisis, it was anyway under a huge pressure, and the automotive industry, it has had and still have a lot of issues related to availability of financing for all this, for the new technology and for reconfiguration, for to adapt to the new reality of what the industry would be. So that's no news to the automotive industry. What it is, maybe it's only trigger point related to the incentives and how this would go. Nevertheless, the time to develop the infrastructure, to develop the technologies, to test them, to put them ready available for the mass market, it just takes some time. Huh? So then there would be some disruption that will come along. I'm sure of that. But how that would how that will show up and what the shape will have, then I guess there are very few who would be able to really say.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Christoph, this another question has come in, and it was alluded to, I think, as one of the longer term impacts that you had outlined on sort of online sales and digital retail. I'm not sure is this something that you've looked at in any kind of depth to get a sense of just how much of an impact is having and could have? You know, does it actually move the dial? Clearly, there's been some necessity whilst deals have been locked down, but how big of a shift is this?
Thank you for mentioning it. That has actually been one of our biggest surprises and most important learnings out of the crisis. When we looked at China and we looked at, I think, February sales, when China was totally locked up, of course, everything was down, but sales jumped back in March to only minus 45% based on pure online sales. And the trick was that these Chinese online sales actually happened on a retailer level. So it was the average salesman, Joe Don salesman, taking his mobile phone and starting a video conference with his client on this concrete car on the parking lot. Totally amazing. No big corporate programs, no SAP, no Microsoft involved, just the mobile phone and the sales guy. And this was, I think, a big learning. So up to now, I think even in Europe, there's been the question, there's always been this contradiction where people were saying that digital sales equals direct sales, and the OEMs are trying to use it in order to get rid of the retailer. What we're now finding out, the retailer is the best digital salesperson, and they're quick to move. Unfortunately, the market in Europe isn't ready for it. Consumers just don't get it. And I don't think we have the structures in place, and we don't have the legal structures in place. But we've really learned there's no contradiction between stationary retail and digital, but they work together optimally when we get the right tools to the retailer and when we get the right tools out into the fleet. I think pretty much as used car sales have shown, used car business is not dominated by OEMs, but it's retailer to retailer, and it works quite well. It's already 100% digital.
Absolutely. So obviously we saw that strong move in China. So that could be an important shift here. But as you alluded, the structures in Europe are probably a little bit behind to make that, or let's say the bureaucracy maybe slows that down a little bit. That's very interesting, and of course I think could obviously have some impacts down the supply chain as well, both from process and also from data and how the whole ecosystem kind of comes together. Obviously we're starting to run low on time, and we've had lots of questions, and so I'm not going to keep everyone for too long, but maybe one of the final questions that's come in, there's been some questions about whether the industry, could be could and will see more financial failures, M&A, consolidation, and obviously this has sort of been alluded to. Liv, maybe I'd turn to you for the supply base, because obviously you were talking before about the difficulties that the industry was already facing, and that would include tier suppliers from low margins long before COVID. So, are you seeing aspects of that? And then maybe Christoph, if you wanted to weigh in on that side as well.
Yeah, it seems like, with all the financial difficulties in place in the sector, then then the market would be open and would be ready for mergers and acquisitions, and even for other types of getting together to make the things done. I think that looking to the new player that comes now with all these let's say terms and conditions that comes from governments, and maybe will slow down a little bit, as we learned that, for instance, European Union said, well, you cannot buy a company supported with the state aid. So let's say to the extent that you will, let's say, be greedy to take the money, then you will maybe not be allowed to do a step in this direction. So that would be one side of the aspect. But nevertheless, I guess that the industry will and will continue to go with the alliances, and will maybe the supply base will copy what the OEMs are doing, but then this is open to see.
Absolutely. And Christoph, obviously before, again, before COVID, FCA and PSA merging, we have alliances. So again, it's not a COVID only situation, but do you see acceleration in this area?
I think I do. And you were alluding to the FCA case. I think we're all a bit anxious about the Renault-Nissan alliance and this kind of area. But I think there's more to it. If we look at the way that an auto company is run today, it's run around platforms. And a platform is not just a vehicle body, but a platform can be an electronics platform, it can be a powertrain platform, it can also be a software platform, such as an autonomous driving platform or a connectivity platform. Each of these platforms is a multi-million, is a hundreds of millions, if not billions euros development or dollars. If you can't get your money back on your own volume, you have to consolidate, either unconsolidate the volume that you cannot cover, or reconsolidate and buy the volume that you want to cover. Along these different dimensions of platforms. And what we've been seeing is, over the last decade or so, we've been seeing consolidation of technology along floor plans. I think we're beginning to see technology consolidation along powertrains. And we will be seeing, and I think, Livio, you called it alliances, consolidation along software platforms. And we're going to see a couple of 100,000 units shifting from one OEM to the other OEM for a certain reason. And the reason is to sort of consolidate volumes into efficient platform sizes. And I think a good overall size for a platform is 1 million units, whatever type of platform it may be. So I don't think that we're really going to see big entities fail, but I think we're going to see shifts, either visible shifts or invisible shifts, either through M&A or through what is called cooperation or alliances.
Absolutely. Well, again, I think there's a lot there to kind of suggest that direction. I mean, the Volkswagen and Ford alliance being one example, but there's many others, as you alluded to, and it could be even less visible than that, especially when we get into the software platforms and aspects too. This has been some fantastic insight here from both of you. So I do want to thank you. There's other questions and other things I wanted to raise. Maybe one thing I'd like to just sort of plug at the end, Livio, just something knowing you and the things that you do, and I think things that come out of crisis which are interesting. And you are someone I know who's active in coaching in supply chain areas as well. And I've been interested to see that you've kind of been doing some coaching as well in the crisis time, and if I'm not mistaken, even for free. So it kind of maybe speaks to the innovative and collaborative ways that the industry kind of has shifted in the past months and stuff. So maybe ending on a bit of a positive note, maybe did you want to just share anything? I know that was something I think some of our audience would be interested in.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. Well, I mean, like a person being for 20 years in the supply chain industry, then I've been around for many years in different roles and in different interaction with a lot of people in culture. And what I could observe is that being an interface function, then it is really challenging to keep the information flowing, to keep everything running, and then on the other side also to balance yourself as a person being part of all that turmoil that goes around. Because then obviously if one of the customer calls and say I need the product, then you have like 1,000 people behind you that they will say I hate you because of that. And then if you go the other way around to say you know what, my product just missed the flight, then there will be another 1,000 people to say they hate you for that. And when you change the planning and when you do anything else, you have a lot of opportunities to collect to yourself lot of lot of pressure, and it started with trying for myself to understand what to do in all that, and stay balanced and stay focused, and just try to do this right. And I guess majority of my peers, they do that, so there's nothing new, there's nothing exceptional what I'm telling you, and I guess many from audience, they will identify with that. Nevertheless, I mean, what I could observe through the years is that as long as you try to understand what is the human part in all that relationship and how this plays a role in going back and forth in the partnership, then brings lot of value add, as controlling yourself and making yourself to give what is necessary and to filter out all this negativity at some points, or to add the human side to it so that you can move it forward. So then I started with that, and then through the years, and I've developed a little coaching that I'm doing with supply chain people, but not only. And then when the crisis came, then I said, well, each of us, we are part of the society, and we need to contribute in a way to the society. So some they volunteer, then they brought water, some they bring food to different persons. And then I said, well, why not? This is what I do, this is what I know how to do. So then let's do that for free. And it was really a great experience, to get to talk to people that they are not my customers, people that I never met, that I meet online, and talk to them about taking them from basics of NLP to go to make them be aware of their emotions, and discuss about mindset, discuss about neurobiology and so on. It was really a fascinating experience, and I had really a great time. And I might do this again, not with a crisis, but just for the fun of doing that.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's good to sort of kind of be reminded of some of the different ways that we work in the human side of this business as much as anything else. So again, with that, let me just to thank both of you again for all of your great time, and thanks again to our audience again for your great questions. Sorry if we didn't get to all of them. We'll collect some of the ones which we didn't and see that we can get some further answers to you. And for those of you who've been following us, we have some follow-up Q&A with Ford from last week, which we'll be coming out with next week. So watch this space. Thanks again to our partners for the Festival of Transformation and for the Livestream Hour. Once again, that's ProAct International, Fract Logistics Solutions, C&W Courier Network, and Horizon Auto Logistics, all very active and important in the automotive logistics and supply chain space. So good companies to call on in a crisis as well. Keep with us next week, kind of following on from some of what Livia was just talking about. We're going to be giving you further updates in the supply chain, but also turning a bit to some leadership questions and management questions. So a bit more of the human side next week with some of our guests then. So please do join us. And it's just a little kind of preview. We've got a lot of great programs coming up over the next weeks, right through to the end of July. And here's just a sneak peek of some of the people that you'll see in the coming weeks. This isn't all, we've got more to come. So that'll include Visteon next week. We've got a great session with Volkswagen's IT leaders and some key companies alongside in the beginning of July. We've got a ports focused live stream in the middle of July with more OEMs will be involved there as well. We've got a special session where we'll be looking at startup OEMs in July 22nd, and we've got we'll have a speaker from Ineos who will have launched its vehicle by then as well. So lots of interesting stuff building up to what will be a season finale, as we're calling it, for our current season of live streams. So we'll take a short break, but in the last week we'll have a lot coming at you that week with multiple sessions and more details to come. So keep in touch and stick with us. It's going to be still a lot more insight to share, and that's going to build up to a lot of great things happening, including a virtual event in the middle of September. So a lot more to come, and we'll be sharing with you. But we look forward to seeing you again next week and the weeks that follow. Get in touch if you've got any other questions, if you've got ideas, if you want to get involved. Our team is always happy and ready to talk. There'll be a video of this session available by tomorrow, and we'll, like we said, if you've got other questions, get in touch and we'll do our best to answer them. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks again to Christoph Stürmer and to Livio Bedian from LEONI. It's been a great session, and we look forward to seeing you guys all again soon.